Okay, class, welcome back. We hope you enjoyed the class so far. Again, my name is Chris Dunaway, if you've forgotten. Today we'll be covering Module 3, which is Garden Planning and Practical Tips. In the words of Ben Franklin, if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. And if you listen to my coworker Anna Timmerman, she's going to tell you, right plant, right place, right time. Super important. So, the absolute first consideration that you need to make when choosing to plant a garden is where you're going to put your garden. So to help you decide that, you need to look at some other questions, some sub-questions, if you will. So, first of all, where do you actually have space for the garden? This is a very big consideration in New Orleans, considering half of our yards are only like 10 feet wide by 20 feet deep. Not a lot of space. And then how accessible is the space is your other question. You want to be able to actually get to the garden, preferably on a daily basis. The further away your garden is from you, the less likely you're going to be able to work in it. And also, not only is it accessible to you, but is it accessible to everything else under the sun? Sometimes that's a bad thing. Another consideration, very important, is how much sun does it get? Whatever your growing season is, you need to know how much sunlight it gets at that time. If you're growing a winter crop versus a summer crop, the sun does rotate and change angles. So you might have a shady spot in the summer and you might have a sunny spot in the winter. Most vegetables need at least 6 hours of direct sunlight. Again, around here, that can be a real problem. We like our trees, but trees cause shade. Shade is bad for gardens. Shade is also bad for grass, by the way, although you're trying to grow grass under oak trees. So another thing you need to consider is how close is it to water? You need to have a good source of water nearby so that you can irrigate these plants when they're not getting rained on. Just about any kind of garden situation, you're going to need supplemental water no matter what. If you're having to carry buckets of water in, and I've done this before, you're not going to be very successful. You want to have a nice hose bib somewhere or some kind of piped irrigation to the garden. Here in these pictures, you can see the person's hand irrigating some crops, whereas the picture on the right there is a nice inline trickle irrigation, which each plant has got its own emitter, so you get watered right at the base. By the way, these in-ground things are a much more efficient way to water your plants. They put the water directly where they need to be, and also it reduces the disease incidence. And of course, does your garden area have drainage? So you want to have sources of water, but then you don't want to have too much water. As you can see in this field, everything here is going to drown, basically, because if you learned in the lesson, number one, on soils, you know that the roots of plants need oxygen as much as they need the moisture. Now, few people do have the perfect garden conditions in their home, in their yard. But what you need to do is you need to choose the best site you have and then make changes to it to improve it. You can do a lot of things. In this picture here, had they maybe hipped up the rows so that the crowns were higher above the water, that could have helped. They could have possibly oriented this field so that all of the rows went down toward the lower area. So that would help increase the drainage. Things like this. You can also add materials to the soil that will improve the structure. Things like that. And then you need to ask yourself, why do you want to grow a garden? Is it going to be a recreational activity? Is it going to be a learning experience for you and a teaching tool for your children? Are you going to grow your own fresh fruits and vegetables? Do you want to grow fruits and vegetables for storage? Let's take number 3 and 4. So, for example, if you want to grow some squash, you only need a few plants if you're going to eat them fresh, because you're going to go out there and harvest every day. But if you want to containerize and store some squash, you may actually want many, many squash plants so you have a much bigger harvest so you can store it and keep it, extend it through the year. And then let's look at how big the garden is going to be. The garden size is very important. one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is, how much space do I actually have? Obviously, you can only plant in the available space, so look at how big your area is and go with that. Another question to ask yourself is, how much time do I have to devote to the gardening? Obviously, the bigger the garden, the longer it's going to take you to take care of it. You should be able to visit your garden at least once a day, preferably twice, in the morning and the evening. This will give you a chance to scout for insects and diseases, check the moisture levels, and any other problems that you might see that you can take care of. If you take care of a problem early, it's not going to come to be nearly as bad later on. And then the last thing is, this is actually related to time, is are you going to be there the entire growing season, or do you have somebody reliable to take care of it while you're gone? There's no reason to plant a garden if you're going to go on a long vacation the next couple of days. We actually have this problem in school gardens a lot, is that because the kids are gone all summer long, frequently the gardens turn into giant weedy messes, or sometimes they plant vegetable plants that don't actually reach maturity while the children are in class, so they don't get the full educational experience that they should be getting. So, next thing we need to ask ourselves is what kind of garden to have. There are three main choices. You have in-grounds, you have raised beds, and you have containers. Now, obviously, in-ground gardens are just right there in the native soil, whereas containers are in some kind of, as the word implies, container, a bucket, some vessel that will hold soil. And raised beds are kind of in between. Most of the time they don't have bottoms, so you kind of have a little mix between the garden soil and then the native soil underneath. And there are other properties. They tend to be larger than container gardens, things like that. But there are slightly different things to consider with each type of garden. And I will go over the advantages and disadvantages of each. One of the advantages of an in-ground garden is that you have the existing soil, so grow in it. It's already there. You just go out and plant right in the native soil. Most soils are perfectly fine for gardening. They should be properly tilled, and they may or may not need amendments, but a soil test will tell you that. Another advantage is the initial startup cost for an in-ground garden is lower. As like I said before, you already have the soil, grow in it. You don't have to go out and buy new soil. Another advantage of in-ground bed is that they sometimes, not always, require less initial labor to start them. So you can pick your spot, you lay out the area, you remove instance vegetation, and use a tractor or tiller to loosen the soil. And there you go, you've got a garden. Another advantage, this could be advantage or a disadvantage actually, is in-ground beds are less permanent. So if you decide that you don't want to have a garden anymore, you can flatten it out, plant a tree, plant some grass, whatever, it's gone. Whereas these raised beds, you might have to do some disassembly, and then you're still going to have a large pile of soil that you need to spread around. In containers, you necessarily empty them and get rid of them, I guess. Another advantage of in-ground beds is that they do usually have lower water requirements, so less irrigation is required. And this, if you remember from the soils class that we just did, the clay particles and the silt particles really hold the water, but just think about the huge volume of soil that's there for the plants to tap into. Has a lot more holding capacity than a raised bed or a container. And also because it's in the same level as the native soil, there's not as much gravitational effects pulling the water down. Disadvantages would be, just like it's an advantage that you're working with the native soil, it's also a disadvantage possibly in that your starting soil is what you have to work with. So you're kind of stuck with it. You can make changes, but it's really hard to make big changes to in-ground soil. You can physically, like I said, hip the rows and add amendments and organic material and stuff like that to improve it, but it really is an uphill battle to get it exactly right if you're far off the point. In-ground, a disadvantage, maybe it could be more difficult to keep pests, diseases, and animals out of an in-ground garden. just because you're maybe dealing with a larger space, something like that. You know, this picture shows the cows running amok in somebody's garden. Another disadvantages are in-ground beds are at ground level, so anybody with a disability or even yourself, you know, a perfectly healthy person bending over all the time, it could give them some backaches and things like that. So let's talk about some advantages of container and raised beds. First of all, you can locate your garden just about anywhere. Again, as long as, you know, you own the space and you have the sun, you can easily fit a raised bed or especially containers into that space. A lot of people can do much more gardening than they ever imagined if they would go ahead and adopt some of this raised beds or container gardening systems. A balcony or a rooftop, even the railing of a stairwell or something like that can be transformed into a holder for containers. Another advantage is you get to choose your starting soil. Unlike native beds where you're just dealing with the native soil, with a container or a raised bed, you can go out and purchase yourself some good manufactured soil or get the best topsoil in the world. And whatever you want, you can get. You can put it in your garden. Another advantage is it's easier to keep certain weeds and pests out of these gardens. They're not in the native soil where a lot of these seeds are living. They're not going to be easily invaded by stolons and other portions of plants that want to invade these gardens. And as far as, yes, again, with pests also, they block some of the invasion from underneath and things like that. So they really can help lower the predation by weeds and pests. You're also less likely to have soil compaction in raised or container gardens. If you remember, we talked before in the soil lab, compaction is when you get the mineral particles that should be spread out and they just keep getting closer and closer and closer together so that there's no more pore space in there. When the water can't go through and the air can't go through, the roots can't grow anymore, the plant will suffer and die. You do have a lot more control over the soil's moisture with a raised bed or container garden. What you put in is what's going to be in there, minus a little bit of rainfall. But the good thing is that because of gravitational effects, the water drains out pretty quickly. Obviously, this does mean it dries out much more quickly, but it's much less likely to ever get waterlogged and have a problem with drowning the plants. Raised beds or container gardens may also be much more aesthetically pleasing than an in-ground bed. There's lots of different things you can do to make the garden more attractive. Here you see a couple of examples, just some landscape tempers in one, and then a very complex system of pavers and retention rocks here on the right side. But feel free to make your garden an expression of yourself and your artistic abilities. Raised beds can also be designed and elevated to make them wheelchair accessible and to reduce bending over. Your back may thank you for this. Some disadvantages of these two types of gardens is that they could have a higher startup expense. You're going to have to buy the soil, you're going to have to buy the containers or border material that you use, you're going to have to get it delivered to your house, and that's even before you've bought the first seed or first transplant plant. So right away you've got lots of expenses that you wouldn't have with in-ground. Raised bed and containers soils also usually have very little clay in them. And this could be a good thing or a bad thing. As we know from the soils lab, the clay is responsible for a lot of the availability of plant nutrients, but clay is also very responsible for poor drainage. So without that holding ability, we do need to fertilize container gardens and raised beds more frequently than we would need to do in-ground beds, because every time we water, basically those nutrients just wash out of the soil. So they need to be continually replenished. Another possible disadvantage of raised beds or container gardens could be the potentially short lifespan. And that really depends on what you use to make your containers out of. If you use untreated wood or cardboard or something like that, then you'll be lucky to get one season out of them. But if you use cinder blocks or even galvanized metal, those could potentially last years. So a lot of it depends on what it's made of, depending on how the lifespan is going to be. And like I mentioned earlier, you're going to have to water. Every drop of water, with the exception of a little bit of rain, is going to come from you in the form of irrigation. Sometimes you may need to do it twice a day, depending on how much soil you have and what plants you're growing. Disadvantages also include the available root space. That may limit some plants and plant choices. And this goes to what Anna was saying, when you choose the right plant for the right place, is that you want to grow a plant that's going to get big in a big pot, whereas you can grow something small in a smaller pot. A lot of people make mistakes with tomatoes, things like that. Tomatoes need at least 5 gallons to grow in, whereas carrots you wouldn't think need very much room, and they don't need much room left and right, forward and back, but they need a lot of depth. Carrots need very deep soil to grow in, so that could be a disadvantage also if you don't have a deep enough container. Also, the available root space goes straight back to how much water is available. So the bigger the container, the more water it will be able to hold between irrigation events. So, what about soil's growing medium? So in in-ground gardens, the soil is already there. You're going to want to take a soil test so that you know what the properties of that soil are and the available nutrients that you have. You're going to add amendments to change the pH if necessary, and then you may need to retest just to see if these amendments are working. And also you're going to want to probably retest every season, because as the plants take up these nutrients, there will be different amounts available from season to season. And of course, as you add the amendments, anything we do to change, either raise or lower the pH, does not happen immediately. It takes months for these things to work. It's a very slow chemical reaction. And that's all improved by how much contact that these amendments have with the soil. So the better you can incorporate them, the quicker it will work. But then there's biological activities, there's moisture, all these things that will contribute to that. So you want to retest and make sure you get the right level and then maintain at the correct level. Okay, class, we're going to take a break now, and we're going to go all the way to the LSU campus in Baton Rouge to the Hill Farm Laboratory classroom, where Dr. Bush has prepared a few videos for us. Dr. Ed Bush is a professor of ornamental horticulture at the LSU AgCenter. He's been with the AgCenter for 33 years. And among his teaching duties, he also does research on horticulture, ornamental plants, as well as vegetables. And currently he's been doing research on raised bed and potting soil mixes. So in his first video, he's going to show us how to improve the in-ground soil that we're talking about right now. Later on, he's going to show us some good mixes for potting soil as well as raised bed mixes. He says he does want you to experiment and try out products for yourself, but he says you can't really go wrong with an equal mix of pine bark, peat moss, and coarse sand with nutrients. And speaking of nutrients, he did mention that if you do want to take a soil test of your potting or raised bed mix, you must take the sample before you add any fertilizers. Added fertilizers will throw off the test. Any amendments will clearly throw off the test. So if you do want to sample it, make sure you take that sample before you add any kind of fertilizer. That's it. So take it away, Dr. Bush.
Okay, one of the cheapest ways to improve a natural soil is using cover crops. And here's a good example of cover crops. It adds organic matter, increases the cation exchange capacity, holds on the nutrients, and holds on the water. If you need to add organic matter, you can use compost that has been composted, or you can actually bring in cow manure that's been composted, or some people put bark. Put about 1 inch or 2 on the soil, till it in, put another 1 inch or 2 and cut it in, and do that over several years, and you'll build your natural soil up to where it can hold a lot of water and hold on to those nutrients.
So as for soil in your raised bed or your container, there are many options. The two main things that we're looking at that are available to us are bagged soil versus bulk soil. Now, bagged soil is simply bulk soil that was put in a bag by a manufacturer. It's much easier to transport. You can actually put it in the back of your car. Bulk soil is manufactured by different people. It's got different amendments and things like this. The thing you need to know is that there's very little industrial oversight over any of this. There is nobody regulating what ingredients go into it. There's nobody telling manufacturers if it should be high or low pH, if it should have nutrients in it. There's no saying if it's got X amount of weed seeds or this or that, anything like this. It's the wild, wild west when it comes to soil. So what to look for in a good potting or container mix? First of all, you want something with really good drainage properties. You should never be able to fill up a pot or a raised bed with water. Every bit of water you pour on there should go straight down, and you should never be able to overtop the container. And it must have good structure and porosity to provide for good root aeration. If you have drainage, you're probably going to have good aeration, so that shouldn't be a problem. Another thing to look for in a potting mix is it must have sufficient texture to support the plant top. So it's got to have enough oomph to actually hold it. You don't want to plant something in a very super light soil mix. If it's going to be top heavy, it might just fall right out of the container. It must be able to retain and reserve a reserve of moisture and nutrients for the plants to use. You know, unless you're doing a hydroponic system where every single bit of the water and nutrients come from you daily, you want it to be able to hold on to some of that moisture. It can't dry out immediately. There have to be those little sponges in there somehow to hold the water and also the nutrients available. Again, like I mentioned, you still will have to provide more nutrients, but not every single time. And it must be light enough to avoid being easily compacted. So again, these clay and silt particles in there, they really increase the compaction ability, and as those particles get closer and closer together and cause that compaction. So what are potting mixes usually made of? First of all, they're usually made from some form of organic matter, like compost, peat moss, sphagnum moss, shredded bark, and other forest products. They usually contain some portion of mineral component, which is the sand, silt, or clay. Most likely you're going to see the sand particles in there rather than the silt and clay. And then some form of inert ingredients to help with porosity and water retention. These can include perlite, vermiculite. Bagged potting mix, again, like I said, there are no regulations by state or federal agencies over the content of these mixes. So there are no standards that define what constitutes a good potting mix, and there are requirements to label a product with the names of the ingredients in decreasing order of volume. That's it. And here's a couple examples. So if you look on the right, you'll see that this product is formulated from 50 to 55% composted bark, sphagnum peat moss, pasteurized poultry litter, and an organic wetting agent. On the other side, it says the ingredients are regularly formulated with organic materials, including one or more of the following. And this, by the way, is showing you that they're not even exactly telling you what's in the bag. They're just telling you what it might be. And they could be forest products, peat, humus, compost, in addition to sphagnum, peat moss, composted manure, and pasteurized poultry litter. So around here, we tend to get bags of rice hulls right after rice season. And quite frankly, it's not a very good soil. So you're really kind of on your own, and you need to do some experimentation to see what you like. And hopefully, maybe some of the classes you've taken can help you decide that. But when I go shopping for bagged soil, I look for one that's already open so that I can at least see what I'm getting before I get home.
Once again, here are container tomatoes. It's Patio Princess tomato. And you can see we're very, very successful with tomatoes as well. They're doing very well. And the next mix we have the professional mix, and you can see they're doing okay, but the leaf color is a little greenish yellow, and probably just from having wet feet, it's holding too much water. You gotta have drainage in the south. And here we have the topsoil. It's not doing too bad. You even have a few little fruit. So they all did okay, but the LSU mix is a perfect combination and example of having just the right amount of drainage and organic matter and holding onto those nutrients with cation exchange capacity. Good afternoon, my name is Dr. Ed Bush, and today we're going to talk a little bit about what's in your potting soil and what amendments can we add to your garden to make it grow big, luscious tomatoes. So I'm going to start off with saying, how do you make a good potting soil? Well, there are different kind of potting soil, so I'm going to start off first with maybe if you want to go ahead and propagate some seeds, or maybe you want to go ahead and root a cutting. We're going to start off with some of the components of that we use. We use things like vermiculite, perlite, and peat moss. And we combine those three in equal portions. Now, all soils aren't made alike, and all soil components are not alike. So what we want to do is, basically, here we can see the perlite is actually a little large. So I don't mind using this for cuttings, but if I had tiny seed, I'd probably want to get a little smaller, or smaller textures, the way we refer to it in horticulture, so that the seeds don't fall too deep and they won't germinate. When we mix those three components together, we don't really worry about too much with fertilizers on propagation medias, because they grow very slow and we can add liquid feed. But when we want to go ahead and do potting soils, that's a whole different matter. Now for homeowners, if we're going to plant flowers inside, we can go ahead and add a lot of different components. There, we're going to add a little different combination of components. We're going to use peat moss, and we're going to use sand, and we might even use pine bark. Believe it or not, in potting soils, and when it says topsoil, most have no soil at all in them. So I know that's hard to grasp, but that's the truth. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how you can make a soil and make it really last. I want to show you this plant right now. Here we have a plant, it's growing in a growing media. It has bark, sand, and peat moss with fertilizer amendments. There's no topsoil in it at all. So we have to give it everything it needs to grow. So how do we do that? Well, after we mix, we have to add fertilizers. One thing we know about pine bark is the majority of what I'm going to talk about today is that it's very acid. So what I want to do is I'm going to add lime. We use dolomitic lime, and we're going to mix it in there. So at the rate of about 8 pounds per cubic yard, that's 27 cubic feet. I have this box. The box here represents 1 cubic foot. And you say, I don't want to build a box, Dr. Bush. That's okay, because all the bags are labeled by their volume. 1 cubic foot, 2 cubic foot, and so on. So you know the volume. So for instance, I might have 4 parts bark, 1 part sand, 1 part peat, 2 parts bark, 1 part sand, 1 part peat. It just depends. And all the different components we have are all different sizes. And just like that, the bigger the plant, the larger particle size we use. Okay, I was talking about pine bark. So one of the things we use a lot of for large containers, especially for outside gardening, is pine bark. It's a good organic, and it's acid, and we can add a little lime and stuff to bring the acidity down, but it has really good drainage, and it's organic, which means it gives you nitrogen. We also use a little bit of sand and a little bit of different components in there, like peat moss, to give us some kind of water holding capacity. We want the ability for water to hold, and in Louisiana and the Southeast, it's really a challenge to have good drainage combined with organic matter to hold on those nutrients and hold the water. So that's our goal. We want to combine those. So what we're going to do is you can make different mixes of this, sand, and peat moss, and then like this commercial mix, Tiger Rub, it actually has the different components already blended together with the fertilizers. If you don't have the nutrients and all in the mix, if you're making your own, you want to go ahead and incorporate into it a micronutrient fertilizer, and you're going to have to go ahead and incorporate lime to bring the pH down. And then we're going to take a trip out to the garden, and I'm going to show you a project we have right now with mixes on how good vegetables grow with different types of potting soil.
Okay.
So LSU has been doing a lot of research on container medias, and this one is developed strictly for vegetables. And you can see it's a very coarse textured mixture that's good. It also has a little bit of peat moss and sand for drainage, but it holds on to moisture, and it's been very productive for, here we have cucumbers, and they're doing extremely well in this mix. On the next pot, we have a professional mix that's probably better off for inside a house. So it stays a little too wet, and you can see the plant struggling a little bit, and it's not doing as good as we'd want. And then on the third topsoil, this is the topsoil that had really too fine of materials. It had rocks in it, and it had very, very low fertility. We are adding liquid feed, but in spite of that, you can see the plants aren't doing as well as the LSU mix. Okay, so here we have very good mix for raised bed. And basically it's a combination of pine bark, sand, peat moss, organic matter with a little bit of manure mixed in it. Now, one thing I want to make sure to mention that I have forgotten before is if you use compost or manures, it has to be properly composted. If you don't, you're going to bring in a lot of weed seeds, and you're actually going to have damage to your plants that you grow. So don't get the free stuff from someone that has cow or chicken manure and it hasn't been composted. Your plants will turn yellow and they'll die. So we got to make sure that we good quality. I can't tell you enough how many times I've talked to homeowners that got free media and they end up losing all their plants. So make sure you know what's in it. Send off a soil test beforehand to make sure there's no damaging salts in it, or it's too low or too high a pH.
And then to maintain a healthy soil, you should soil test at least once to 3 years. This will give you an accurate picture of what's going on in the soil and what you need to do to adjust it. Another thing you can do is, it's important, is replenish the organic matter annually. So you want to add about 2-inch layer of compost, leaf mold, or composted manure, and you really want to incorporate it. It's not, you don't just put it on top, you actually mix it in there. If you don't keep adding this organic material to the bank, as Anna told you before, you're going to quickly overdraw and run out. It is important to maintain the proper pH, as we discussed in the soil lab. If you remember this chart here, it shows you the availability of the nutrients at various pH ranges. So you're going to want to adjust the pH so that the plants that you're growing are the happiest. So if you're growing an acid-loving plant, you're going to want it lower, but if you want some plants that are like alkaline conditions, you're going to raise that pH up higher. And of course, to maintain soil, like I've already mentioned, it's important to fertilize, but you don't just want to fertilize, you want to fertilize thoughtfully. You want to make sure that you understand the products that you're using, how much of the nutrients it is actually providing, and then adjust that to the needs of your plants. We have a whole other section coming up about fertilizer later on in the class, but just remember, not all fertilizers are the same. So now we're going to switch into building a raised bed. Like we said, one of the very first things you want to do is select a site. You need to make sure that it's got the adequate sunlight, it's got accessibility and moisture, and accessibility for yourself. Notice here in the garden on the right that not only is it probably close to the house, but there are pathways in between the beds, and the gardener can reach into them and reach all areas of the garden easily. Next thing you want to do before you put in your raised bed is level the area as much as possible. Try to get the ground where it's going to be nice and smooth, not too many elevation changes. Eliminate big chunks of things that are going to be in the way. You want a nice, consistent depth of soil all the way across the whole garden. Next, choose your building material and build your raised bed. The selection of building materials is hugely important to have a lot of effects later on when as you garden. But you should have a minimum depth of 8 inches, and we recommend at least 12 and preferably 18 inches if you can get it. And it should be no wider than 1.5 your arm's length. So you want to be able to reach over pretty easily and reach in, get to the center of the garden. And this could change for children. You want to have a narrower bed than you could have for adults. So a brief word on building materials for your garden. There are lots of things to choose from. You have to consider the cost of the product. Some things are clearly more expensive than others. You have to consider the workability of the product. Like, are you going to be able to actually deal with this material? Do you have a saw to cut boards? Do you have some snips to cut tin? Sometimes, say in the lower right-hand garden, the cinder blocks, a lot of people choose those because the only requirement is you be able to pick up about 10 pounds and move it around. There's no cutting or anything like that required, so they could be an easy choice. Then you have to consider the lifespan. How long do you expect it to last in the garden? Do you want it to be around forever, or is this just a temporary project that you're going to try out and maybe change out later? So you choose the material based on that. One thing I can tell you, though, is if you're dealing with treated wood, it's not necessarily a better thing to go thicker, because actually the treatment doesn't penetrate nearly as deeply. So at a garden we're working at, it was originally set up with 6x6 timbers, and the center of every single one of these things is rotting out because that treatment did not penetrate. You really want to stick with your 2x dimensions, 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s, 2x12s, because that 2 inches allows the treatment to penetrate. So you would think that a 6x6 would last longer than a 2x6, but you're wrong. Sometimes you don't have to build it at all. I mean, take a look at these examples here. You have plastic containers, bathtubs, these galvanized animal troughs that you see on the lower left are very popular. There's so many things that you can use. The definition of a container garden is gardening in a container. So anything that will hold the soil can be used as a container as long as it meets the other criteria that we discussed. It can be a good idea to line the floor of the garden with some kind of material before you fill it with soil. This is especially true if you're worried about insects or weeds coming in from the bottom. If you're really worried about drainage, though, you may want to leave it uncovered. So once you've got your garden built, the only thing left to do now is choose your plants and get growing. The LSU AgCenter has many sources of information that will help you choose the plants. We have guides like the tomato guide for the most popular crops. There's this excellent publication, Louisiana Home Vegetable Gardening Guide. And then you've got on the far right, the Louisiana Vegetable Planting Guide. Now these informations will help you throughout the state of Louisiana. If you want to be more specific, we have the GNO Gardening newsletter that comes out once a month with articles and growing lists that will work in our area. If you live outside of the state, please contact your own horticulture extension agents to find out what will grow in your area. So thank you very much. Please check the links that you've been sent so you can post to the message board. Check out the extras in the extras folder. There are going to be some links to videos and other information that will be very useful to help you get your garden and make it a success.
So what I want you to do is have a happy gardening day and tell them LSU sent you.